You said that Auburn has been better than Alabama since 1980.
No.
And then the next caller, you seem to have clarified that and said no, up until Saban, 1980 until Saban.
Yes. Okay. My original comment was, I said, if you take the end of the Bear Bryant era, which of course was 1982, but I'm going to round it off to roughly 1980 when Pat Dye started to lift the Auburn program, that Auburn was slightly better than Alabama in the 80s. And if you look at over the entirety for these 40 years, okay, it's been 40 years roughly since 1980.
Mm-hmm.
Saban's been there for 13, that you could make the argument that Auburn was better than Alabama. That minus Saban, I was making the point that we shouldn't look at Alabama as just automatically they're better than Auburn. And that Auburn should just concede everything to Alabama and say they're always going to be better. It's not, who could we liken this to? It's not Ohio State and Wisconsin. That's about where those programs are in the SEC. It's Ohio State and Wisconsin. But it's all about Nick Saban, basically. Because other than Nick Saban, for the previous 30 plus years, Auburn was just as good and more times than not better than Alabama. Probably held a more than 50-50 ratio of head-to-head wins and having a better record.
You take out the Saban years, meaning you go from 1980 to 2006, Auburn would hold a 15-12. So you would be correct in that. I feel like you're arbitrarily just cutting out pretty much everything, every advantage Alabama program has when you're comparing the two programs. First of all, if you started at 1980, which is hilarious to me because you're taking out, you're leaving out the 78 and 79 title we won. So you cut it right after those. But yeah, you started then, again, that's what happens. You say we need to take Saban out, but then you don't do it the other way. You don't say, okay, well, to be fair, then now we need to take Tupperville out for Auburn. If you don't look at it before 1980, Alabama crushed the series. And even with that 15-12 lead before Saban, we still had a 6-game lead on them. So I feel like like I said, I feel like you're just kind of somehow cutting a slice of the pie that doesn't have all the ingredients.
Well,
you're trying to make Auburn look like they're more evenly matched in this than they actually are.
Well, it's not like I'm saying, okay, let's take 1984, 87, 92. It's not like I'm cherry picking. I'm taking a block of over 35 years consecutively. And I'm not saying Auburn run roughshod over Alabama. I'm saying that they were comparable. And if anything, Auburn might have been slightly better. And then I'm saying Nick Saban is Nick Saban. He's the greatest collegiate coach in history. So yes, that's the reality now that Auburn has to deal with. But I'm saying it's not as though we're comparing Alabama and Vanderbilt, or to take it to another conference, Alabama's Ohio State and Auburn's Wisconsin, where the faces change and the programs go through different phases, but it's still Ohio State's Ohio State, one of the 2 or 3 or 4 best, and Wisconsin's still at like a top 15. And there's this separation that's existed forever and probably will continue to. We haven't seen that with Auburn and Alabama outside of Nick Saban and Bear Bryant for 35 years, 37 years in between. Yeah, 35 years, 82, 07. Auburn competed well. That's a long time, 35 years.
Yeah, I never said they did, but I never like arguments where you say, well, if you just take this away from that side, then this side over here looks pretty good.
Well, you do have to.
You take Nick Saban away. By the way, Auburn has had Nick success against Saban. They won 5 games against them, more than anyone than in any other program.
Oh, Auburn has. I got you.
So
Okay, so
yeah,
but it's almost like saying, you can. So there is credibility and validation to what you're stating, but I also believe that there's validation to what I'm stating. If we were sitting here having an argument, Ohio State and Michigan, and I said, Michigan won the first 15 games in the series when nobody could watch the games and they're not even wearing helmets. But if we take those games out, they count in the series record. The game from 1898 counts just as much as the game from 2015. They're all the same. But if I said, I think Ohio State's won the series, they have been a better football program for most of this time. And, the first 15 games, I don't know that a lot of people would challenge that. They would say, okay, we can understand the point that you're making, that if you lop off the first 15 games of the series, suddenly Ohio State's record over Michigan becomes pretty decided. So I'm basically saying that Bear Bryant's one of the greatest coaches of all time, up until the last 5 to 10 years. Most would say the greatest. And now we've got the greatest. And we had 35 years in between where Auburn was just as good, if not better, and probably slightly better than Alabama.
If we just want to say from that period, 1980 to 2006, then yes, they were. They each have one national title during that time period, and Auburn has more wins. So just by sheer numbers alone, Auburn would be a better program. By the way, I wasn't calling to try and argue and say, no, Auburn shouldn't hold themselves up this high. I think they should. I do think you're not quite appreciating the pound for pound difficulty of the Auburn head coaching job.
I'm not.
It's a harder job than Alabama.
I've posted a video that said it's the most difficult job in the country if you consider the expectations.
Okay, then I'm wrong. I didn't see that video.
If you weigh the expectations,
I think Gus Malzahn, what I'm saying with that is, unless you find Nick Saban or Urban Meyer or Dabo Swinney, I think Gus Malzahn was just about as good a coach as you could have expected. He has more wins against Saban than anyone else. And he got them to a national title game. He blew it in the last 2 minutes, but he still got them there.
Mm-hmm.
Been kind of disappointing, when losing 4 games here and there. But you also got to remember, you were comparing Malzahn to Tuberville. Tuberville got out of coaching. I thought, well, no, he went to Texas Tech, but he got out of Auburn was forced to leave Auburn right as the SEC was coming to its height in power, right as they began their 7-0 run in the BCS. Tuberville took off or was kicked out.
Okay.
So Tuberville, if you just look at it on a board, did things at Auburn that Gus Malzahn couldn't do, not the least of which was going undefeated in 2004 and running 6 in a row on Alabama, including 1 against Nick Saban. But he was not competing against the SEC that Gus Malzahn has. He was not competing against the Georgia or the Alabama or the LSU. Oh, well, I mean, LSU 2003, so I'm taking there. But he did not compete against the Texas A&M on an annual basis that Auburn has had to do now that Gus Malzahn's there.
Yeah, I think that's a little overstated. He competed against a really good SEC. He competed against a better Tennessee during that time and a better Florida for most of that time than the Florida we've seen since. And yes, LSU was pretty much LSU throughout his run there. Saban showed up in 2000. That was Tuberville's second season. And LSU was LSU a better LSU than what we've seen since, except for 2019, than the LSU we've seen since Les Miles.
Right. LSU, the difficulty of LSU back then would be comparable to the difficulty of Auburn having to play Georgia every year right now.
Sure.
But still, I mean, if you want to say that Tennessee was really tough back then, fine. I'll give you Texas A&M or the LSU of right now. But playing Nick Saban in Alabama every year, there's no comparison. Tuberville dealt with nothing.
That's
like
one
that.
game. That's one game.
Gus Malzahn has had success against that kind of program.
I know. So he won 3 games and he lost 6, and he was 3-5 before this past pandemic year. So it still counts 3 and 6, but just making the point that within 8 years he won 3 times. So nobody's come close to that against Nick Saban in the SEC. Urban Meyer's got a small sample size, but I'm also thinking about Mark Richt's Georgia teams throughout Tommy Tuberville's run. They were really good. They almost won national championships in 02, 05, 07. He caught the beginning of Urban Meyer, 06, 07, 08. 2 of those 3 national championship teams from Urban Meyer. That was during Tommy Tuberville's Auburn stint.
Mm-hmm. I see your point there. I still do think the SEC as a whole is more difficult now than the one that Tuberville faced. And I think a lot of people are just so willing to bury Gus Malzahn because he just loses the weird games. And honestly, there's no excusing that. He should be doing better than 8-4 every year. But
granted,
I still think he's doing almost as good as can be expected at the hardest job in the country. Well, unless you manage to find Dabo Swinney as your next hire.
And the one distinction I'll make about Dabo Swinney versus the other 2 coaches you mentioned, Saban and Meyer, is that, and I'm sure Dabo Swinney could do what he's done at Clemson elsewhere, but he also has only done it at one place. The other 2 guys, I think, distinguish themselves because wherever they've walked on a campus, they just win. They've gone different places. They've proven they can go anywhere and win. Dabo Swinney's a Clemson guy at this point. I know he's an Alabama guy originally, but he's done it at Clemson. I have little doubt he could do it elsewhere, but he hasn't had to. So I distinguish Saban and Meyer as being just guys that walk on any campus in America as long as they've got talent to work with, and they're going to win.
Right. Well, anyway, I personally think it was kind of a silly move to let him go this year. Again, I think he's had just about as good a success as you can expect at that job in this day and age. I mean, it's just not. I don't think that job has ever been harder than it is right now. And I do think part of the reason probably was the recruiting class. It was they were in the 40s before Gus Malzahn started getting whispers of him getting fired. And that's just unacceptable. Maybe someone had tipped him off at the beginning of the year. It's like, look, we're going to play nice for the PR and something, but you're not going to be here next year. So maybe he didn't try. I can kind of actually see that happening. I mean, it's kind of inexplicable how low Auburn finished in recruiting this year. So, maybe it's something like that. But I think Auburn fans do expect more than they're going to realistically get. I think they are looking at what Saban's doing at Alabama and thinking that they should be doing that. Whereas, I'm an Alabama fan, and I don't realistically think anyone, even Alabama, before or after Nick Saban, should be looking at that and comparing yourself to this. Ohio State, USC, Texas, Oklahoma, Notre Dame. None of these programs have had this kind of run, in such a short amount of time. It's just not feasible.